Welcome back to our next question and answer session. Thank you to all of you who have written your questions in. Once again, I apologize for being a little bit slow in getting to your answers. And I also apologize because previously you were posting your answers on SurveyMonkey, and unfortunately we lost a lot of those answers. So we have a new format, a new system for doing that. So hopefully that will not happen again. So once again, I apologize for that. So if you have previously asked questions which were not answered, please send them in again, and hopefully I will get to them as soon as I can. Today's question is the following. Hi, Father Stephen. Going to try and remember my question. Recently, there has been an explosion of scandals in the church, like the McCarrick case last year. But this year seems to have more confusion than ever that I remember on the Vatican or Pope Francis or other cardinal statements, including disturbing sermons from priests going against the CCC. How does one try to not be swept up in the confusion and to discern what is true, even if their knowledge about what is the truth of Catholic teaching versus someone's own views? Thanks. So, very, very good question, an important question. So the CCC that the person mentioned refers to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So the person referred to disturbing sermons from priests going against the CCC or the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And yes, there have been scandals, there's confusion in the church, teachings contradicting what Christ clearly taught and what the church has always officially taught. So how are we to deal with all this confusion? One priest says another thing, one priest says one thing, another says another, same as with bishops and so on. So I believe that the person also kind of alluded to the fact when we engage someone who has different views than the ones that we hold, in other words, views contrary to what the church has always taught, how are we to deal with such persons? So very, very important questions and very relevant to our times. First of all, I wanted to point out that what we see happening in the church today, all this confusion and all this contradiction and, people teaching things that are clearly contrary to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's a reminder that these things are pointing to the end times, or the presence of these things in our age indicates that we are getting closer and closer to the very end times. So we don't know when the end times will be, but it's good for us to be prepared. And I wanted to read to you from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 15 to 24. This is what it states, Matthew 24, 15 to 24. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let him who is in the field not turn back to get a coat. And alas for those who are with child, and for those who are nursing in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. And if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Then, if anyone says to you, Behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. So, it's a very interesting passage. And there's a kind of a parallel passage in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verse 20. In the Gospel of Mark, it clearly indicates that these terrible things that will be happening are going to be like natural catastrophes, like earthquakes and plagues and pestilences and things like that. And I think that's only part of it. So the reason I chose the Gospel of Matthew to read to you is because in the Gospel of Matthew, it implies that it's more of a spiritual crisis, that there will be false Christs and false prophets, and it will be a time of great tribulation, a time of great trial for believers. Now, this advice to flee to the mountains when we see these things happening, it's really, part of it is a reference to the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem. So Christ had predicted this, and the Christians living in Jerusalem, when they saw the Roman armies gathering, they knew what was coming. They fled. Most of the Jewish people stayed to fight, to defend Jerusalem, and statistically they say roughly 1 million Jews were killed trying to defend Jerusalem, whereas the Christians escaped. But as we know, when there are these types of prophecies, especially pertaining to the temple, they also point to the end times. So in the scripture, whenever Christ spoke about the end of the world, he also spoke about the end of the temple in Jerusalem. So we need to make that connection. So not just natural catastrophes, but corruption of the faith, a massive falling away of the faith. Now, the reference to Daniel, the person standing in the holy place. So this reference to Daniel of the desolating sacrilege. So when you see the desolating sacrileges spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And you can look to the prophecy of Daniel if you wanted to look it up, but we're not going to look into that. So what is the holy place? There have been some people who speculated, well, it refers to the Catholic Church, the Vatican in particular. And while it's true that we can make some form of argument for that, some commentators say that that's not an appropriate interpretation of that passage, that it does specifically refer to the temple. And the belief is that in the end times, when the Antichrist manifests himself, he will be a great political leader. He will be extremely intelligent, extremely influential, extremely powerful. He will bring about the greatest persecution of Christians. He will claim that Christ was an impostor, and he will set himself up as the Messiah, as God incarnate even, and he will enable the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt, or at least partially rebuilt. An interesting fact is that the Jewish people have tried many times to start rebuilding the temple, and each time there was something that prevented them from being able to do it, and even to this day, they are not able to rebuild the temple. So near the end times, or at the end times, they will be able to rebuild it, or at least partially to rebuild it, and the Antichrist will seat himself in the temple, or an image of himself, and basically require people to worship him. So that has not happened yet, but the Antichrist will manifest himself even before that happens. So we don't know when this is going to occur. It is true that when it comes to the church, when we think of corruption in the church, it's not just in our own age. So, even at the time of the Protestant Reformation, part of the reason Luther was rebelling against the church is because he saw so much corruption in the church. And this corruption in the church at various times in the history of the church have been more extensive or more severe than at other times. And yes, there have been some very bad popes, some very scandalous type of popes. And I don't want to go into the details of some of the terrible things that they have done. But yes, there have been bad popes in the past. And we shouldn't have this view that, every pope is holy and saintly just because he's the pope. And the same with priests and bishops. We know that some priests, bishops have done horrible things. You mentioned Cardinal McCarrick, and there have been others also. So just because one is a priest, it doesn't automatically make them holy. In fact, they are open to greater attack from the evil spirits because the evil spirits want the priest or the bishops to fall. So it's important for priests to be especially on guard, to be prayerful, to be penitential, and to live their lives the way that they are called to. During the end times, yes, there will be more pressure on Catholics to compromise their faith and to accept the political correct view of things from the point of view of the world. And we see this happening today also. Not just within the church, but also in the Catholic school systems, which in some sense is part of the church, but especially recently in regards to the Gay Pride month, which is June, and the Cardinal has mentioned that Catholic schools should not fly the Gay Pride flag, but rather the Canadian flag, because it's inclusive, and as Christians we are called to love everyone, no matter what a person's sexual orientation may be. And our position is that we shouldn't sexualize our children, especially very young children, in the elementary schools. So yes, there needs to be some sex education, absolutely, but we have to have a Catholic identity, and that's what we should go by. And some people have argued that flying the Gay Pride parade flag symbolizes everything that the Gay Pride parade stands for, and we know it's very, very immoral. Even if it was a heterosexual pride parade and there was that kind of explicitness and sexuality that's kind of in your face, we would still say it's very, very inappropriate, and I'm sure we can all agree with this. But I just read in the news that they've decided, the Catholic trustees, to go ahead and to fly the Pride flag, even though the gay Pride flag, even though the Cardinal has asked them not to. So it just goes to show that there's no respect for the Cardinal, and in many ways the Catholic schools are drifting further and further away from their Catholic identity, which is very unfortunate. And of course, children raised in that kind of environment are more likely to fall away completely from the practice of their faith. So it's not surprising that the number of atheists is increasing in the world. It's also true that priests often do not preach on the reality of hell, the reality of sin, or even the difference between mortal sin, venial sin, and also specific sins, as well as general or common sins in society, such as abortion, euthanasia, and we can go on and on with a whole list of these things. In October of 1946, so quite some time ago, October 1946, Pope Pius XII made the following statement: "Perhaps the greatest sin in the world today is that men have begun to lose the sense of sin." Whew. Let's review that. Perhaps the greatest sin in the world today is that men have begun to lose the sense of sin. He made this statement in 1946. It's so much more true today that people have lost the sense of sin. So they're not taught about sinful things by the clergy, by the church in general, and the media has so influenced people that they think that things that are commonplace now are totally acceptable, even though they are clearly sinful. So the use of drugs, the legalization of marijuana, pornography, premarital sex, the use of artificial contraceptives, abortion, assisted suicide, euthanasia, and we can just go on and on. So it's very, very unfortunate, but this is the reality. People have lost the sense of sin. They think there's nothing wrong with these things. And as time goes on, people become even more and more comfortable with these things. And it's worthwhile noting that when people lead a sinful lifestyle or believe that such things are okay, in other words, they have the wrong kind of viewpoint, having such a viewpoint or engaging in these types of activities drastically impairs a person's ability to see clearly. In other words, our intellect becomes even more clouded than it already is. and we have a harder time rationalizing things. So, for example, people who are pro-choice, well, they've suppressed their conscience and they totally believe what they are saying. Oh, it's just a blob of tissue, it's not a human being, which is totally false. And we can prove that it's a human being. It has its own genetic makeup, different from the mother's genetic makeup, combination of the mother's genes and the father's genes. But it's a unique human being. It's a unique individual at its earliest stages of development, yes. So they've suppressed their consciences, they have suppressed the truth, and when we try to convince them of the truth, they're just blind. And often they're motivated by passion. So sometimes it's anger because they feel it's a woman's right. Sometimes it might also be anger because they're angry with themselves. They may have had an abortion, they're angry at themselves, but they're projecting that anger at those who want to remind them of the truth. So the ideal is that they deal with that truth and acknowledge, yes, I committed a sin, but I can go to confession. I can seek forgiveness from Jesus. And it's wonderful to know that. I mean, we all make mistakes. So I don't want to make people feel bad just because maybe they had an abortion. Yeah, yes, it's a horrible thing, and ideally people shouldn't do it. But if you have done it, we want to provide you with the healing graces of God. We want, if you need to get counseling, we want to encourage you to do that. And it has been pointed out that many people become kind of self-destructive. They harm themselves because they hate themselves for what they have done. So it is an important issue. But as I mentioned, Pope Pius XII made this statement that people have lost the sense of sin, and it's so much more true today. And yes, society is very sinful. We do live in a corrupt world, and we see greater and greater corruption, not just in the world, but also within the Catholic Church. And that's to be expected. So, especially when we as Catholics aren't living our faith the way that we should be, and especially after the Second Vatican Council, confession was kind of stopped in many places. Communal confessions took place instead of individual private confessions. Sin wasn't taught about. The idea that everyone goes to heaven, became more popular, and so many things. The liturgy was corrupted, and it became kind of just a social event between the priest and the people instead of a ritual act of worship and sacrifice to God, offering the sacrifice of the cross to our Lord or to God in an unbloody manner. So yes, all these things are very unfortunate. They are happening. They have happened. And yes, there has been an explosion of priest scandals. And this explosion actually corresponds to the sexual revolution, which took place in the 60s and the 70s and continues to this day. So it's from that time period. I mean, there's been, sexual abuse by clergy even before, but not to that extent. In other words, everybody just started sleeping with everybody outside the church, and so that influence entered into the church. Priests were more tempted. The media had a lot to do with that. Now, I don't in any way want to excuse the behavior of these priests just because of the influence of the media or societal trends. I don't want to excuse them, but it's important to understand why these things are happening. We cannot ignore the fact that if we watch television and watch inappropriate things, it's going to affect us one way or another. So we need to be prudent in regards to what we are watching. So many priests, as I mentioned, are influenced by these things. Anyone can be, including myself. And this is why, as priests, we need to pray, we need to fast, we need to practice self-denial. Not everybody is capable of fasting, but you can eat less, or you can eat more healthy, or cut out sweets, or not eat between meals. There's so much that we can do. So doing penances, having a very good prayer life, going for spiritual direction, going for confession on a regular basis. Many priests, even today, do not do these things. So traditional-minded priests tend to do it more so than others. So The other thing is that, the person asked about the McCarrick scandal and other things. And, most Catholics probably know about that. But the reality is that most Catholics don't really follow Catholic news. And even when someone does follow Catholic news, it's like there are some publications or websites that are more progressive, and there are more that are more traditional. Some are more kind of very, very traditional. Some are a little bit between. So a lot of people don't really know what's going on. They don't realize what the crisis in the church is. It reminds me of a book I recently ordered for my mom. It's written by Ralph Martin. I think it's called Crisis in the Church Today. But it's about what's happening in the church and the confusion. I just started reading it, so I've only gone through one chapter, and it seems to be very, very good so far. So you could look into that if you're interested. So yes, most Catholics don't realize what's going on. They don't have a right understanding of things. And sometimes, depending on which publications they're reading, they have a different point of view also. So it is very difficult to talk to them. And I think it is important that we do try to talk to them, because some people think, oh, well, everything is fine in the church. There's no problems in the church. It's not true. There are a lot of problems in the church, and yes, it's not just people teaching against, the catechism, but introducing things that are very contrary to our faith. And some people are speculating, it wouldn't be surprising if we started having female deacons, or that some places might allow the ordination of women. And also we see greater divisions in the church. So the Pope has allowed, for example, the German bishops to have a synod on their own and to decide things for themselves. And some of the German bishops are very, very progressive and want to ordain women and things like that. So, that kind of synodality or a synod of bishops in various areas can be very good for local issues, but it can also be very bad if they have too much power and are allowed to do their own thing, contrary to the tradition of the church. So my advice is that, yes, we do need to inform people of what is going on, but we have to be very prudent. So if they're not open to it, then we shouldn't. But hopefully they know that, yes, there are some bad clergy. And, even with parishioners, they sometimes prefer one priest over another priest, and there's nothing wrong with that. So people who are traditional minded will tend to prefer a traditional minded priest. It kind of makes sense. So we can prefer our own priests, but it's good to know that sometimes there are bad priests, and if there are, then we need to stay away from them and from their influence. But it's also extremely important for us as Catholics to know our faith. So in other words, when were you catechized? Maybe you were catechized when you were in grade school. Maybe you went to grade school in, India or one of those places where Catholicism is very strong. Maybe you had a good formation, but the formation that young people are getting today is not sufficient. Usually parents aren't equipped enough to properly educate their children in the ways of the faith. Coming to church on Sundays, if the priest, especially if he has a very short homily, there's no way he's able to catechize people. I mean, even now, many adults, many Catholics do not know their faith. I remember going to bless somebody's house, and I mentioned to him what we celebrate on Christmas, and he was surprised that Jesus is God. He knew that Jesus was the Son of God, but he didn't know that Jesus was God. And I said, well, what do you think we celebrate on Christmas? So this was an adult, someone who had been Catholic all his life and grew up in a Catholic home, went to Catholic schools, and he just didn't know that Jesus is God. So we need to know our faith. It's very, very important. And yes, we can and should look to the official teachings of the Catholic Church, which is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. There we find the official teachings. We can read other things also and should read other things, and it's good for us to do that. We also need to be careful that we're not just focused on the news and this scandal and that scandal. It's good for us to know about these things, yes, but what we need to focus on is our own personal spiritual life, our own personal spiritual growth. St. Philip Neri, a very great saint of the late 1500s, early 1600s, said that we should read books that begin with the letter S. In other words, books that are about saints or written by saints. And these things will nourish us spiritually. And this should be our primary focus. You know, there's so much news, so much information. To a certain extent, we need to know these things, yes. But the real focus ought to be our spiritual life. The other thing is that we shouldn't worry about these scandals. Some people are very worried, and they point out that, you know, actually today there are more liberal, progressive cardinals and bishops, and they outnumber the more traditional-minded. And by traditional-minded, I mean the ones who hold on to the truths that have been taught from age to age. And they're worried, you know, what kind of future does this hold for the church? And they become very discouraged, very despondent. Even people who are considering a vocation, they're saying, well, how can I join a church or become a priest in such a church if this is the reality? So we shouldn't worry. Remember, Christ promised that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. So yes, as time goes on, especially if we are in the end times, at some point the church may have to go underground. And as Pope Benedict, while he was still a cardinal, in one of his interviews pointed out, he foresees a time when there will be only pockets of Christianity in certain places in the world. So we have to be ready and willing to face that kind of situation. And we should not forget the message of Our Lady of Fatima. She said that Russia will spread her errors. What are these errors? Basically communism, atheistic communism. And we see this happening in the world, spreading. So under an atheistic communist system, atheism is promoted, religions are suppressed, but there's also control of the people, control of the masses. And this is what the Great Reset seems to be about also, that they want to have control of everyone. And, you know, they are planning to take advantage of the present situation, as prominent individuals in the world have stated this fact. Prince Philip, even our own Prime Minister have stated this fact that, you know, they're planning for this great reset. And once they have total control of us, they will be able to determine whether we are free to buy or to sell or to work or whatever, or to travel, you know, all these passports and things that they will be able to monitor us. Once they have that power, they will use that power. And depending on who's in control, they might say, well, if you don't accept the political correctness of our time and stop preaching your own personal beliefs, you know, we're going to restrict your freedoms. So there's going to be greater pressure on Catholics as time goes on. So Russia will spread her errors, but as Our Lady said, countries will be annihilated, but in the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph, and there will be an era of peace. So this reference to countries being annihilated, it's possibly physical annihilation, as in the sense of nuclear war or something like that, but I'm realizing that this refers more to spiritual annihilation. In other words, countries where the faith is totally lost, where the country is primarily atheistic and very much communistic. So think of China, think of North Korea. This has already happened. And these are communist systems, and the rest of the world wants to imitate them. They think communism is good. In theory, there's a lot of good to it, yes, but in actual practice, it's not good, because power corrupts, and the more power an individual has, the more corrupt they become. And that's why it's so important for people in positions of authority to be extremely close to God, to be very prayerful, self-sacrificing and penitential, so that we are sure that we are on the right path. So these things have not happened. Our Lady's Immaculate Heart has not yet triumphed. This era of peace has not yet come about. So it is to come. But I think we have to experience these conflicts, these trials, these tribulations before it happens. I encourage all of you to have great devotion to Our Lady, to consecrate yourself to Our Lady. St. Louis de Montfort emphasized that this will be especially necessary near the end times, and so have others such as St. John Bosco and many others. So consecration to Mary, great devotion to the Eucharist, and yeah, so don't be worried. Trust in God. Do the best that you can. Don't worry about the future. Try to be as holy as you possibly can be. And that's all we can do. And yes, we should pray for world leaders, political leaders, but also for the leaders of the church. Thank you so much for asking that question. God bless you all.